Hey everyone, thanks for joining me to talk about getting started with Amplify. This talk isn't really about specifically getting started with just the Amplify basics. It's more about adding some of those features that you would want, such as authentication, and working with your team and being able to deploy your application into the cloud. So who am I? I'm Greg Coben. I'm the Principal Practice Lead at AC3 in Sydney. You can find me on Twitter at GurgenZ and on GitHub at github.com/GurgenZ and on LinkedIn with a very similar URL. So what are we going to be talking about today? I'm going to be talking about adding authentication to Amplify. Now, Amplify under the hood uses Cognito. Cognito is another service that's available from AWS. I'll talk about how Cognito and Amplify offers the authentication options and how the authentication flow works. I'll then dive into a specific feature, and that is adding Google authentication to a really simple application. Then I'll briefly touch on some options that you have to go from there. After that, I'll give a very quick introduction into the Amplify Console, an overview of what's available, adding domains, managing branches, and password protecting your environment. Then we'll jump into a few questions if there are any. Okay, what is Amazon Cognito? Amazon Cognito is a service that's been around for a few years now. It's a simple and secure user sign up, sign in, and access control. It's got its own internal database that you can use. It provides the front end for users to sign into and all of the components that you kind of need. Additionally to that, it also has some integration that you can do, such as Facebook, Google, Amazon, and enterprise identity providers via SAML 2.0, such as Active Directory, etc. You can integrate it into mobile apps as well as your web front end. So, the authentication mechanisms that are available via Amplify are Apple, Google+, it's still known as Google+ in the Amplify documentation, Amazon, and Facebook. As I said earlier, there are a few more that are available, but out of the box, Amplify doesn't let you, it's not that it doesn't let you, it means that there's a few more hoops that you have to jump through to make it work. So you might have to dive into the CloudFormation to make it work, or make some changes after the fact, or a custom resource or something like that. But out of the box, we've got Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook. All right, so let's have a look at how the authentication flow works. As you can see here on the screen, you've got your device, which might be an Android device, or an iOS device, or your web front end, or whatever it is. Like there's all, you could use a TV device or something like that. So the login is passed over to the developer provided front end, and then that has to go and get a GetOpenID token from Cognito, passes it back to the device, and then the JavaScript or your application then goes off and gets the credentials from the AWS STS servers. So for those who don't know, the AWS STS service is part of IAM and will give you temporary credentials to access different services. In Amplify, this is likely going to be things like DynamoDB for storing data, a GraphQL or REST API endpoint, or maybe even a database, RDBMS database such as the Aurora serverless. Okay, so let's walk through a simple example. In this one, I'm going to just create a really simple app. I use Yarn, so we do a Yarn create React app. I'm using React as the framework in this scenario. And the name of my application, I'm just calling it Auth Test. So we create that, CD into that environment. We add the Amplify UI React components to it, set up the environment with Amplify in it, and start our local server, which is available on localhost :3000. Git add and git commit, because we're good developers and we want to make sure that we're tracking all of the changes that we've made to the environment. Now, the localhost :3000 is just your development environment, and if you're adding this to production, you might want to use an Amplify hosted environment, which we'll talk a little bit later on. But for the purposes of the demonstration, we'll use localhost 3000. Hopefully, if you then browse to that URL, localhost :3000 on a browser, you get something like this showing up. Awesome. First step completed. Okay. Now on to the Google application setup. For this demonstration, I used my Gmail credentials. I have a number of other G Suite domains, but I used the Gmail one so that you could see how it can work for you. It is possible to limit the access, and I'll dive into that a little bit later on as part of the setup. And you are limited to a certain number of accesses per day by default, and you might need to look at changing your developer credentials if required. Okay, so first off, we need to go over to console.developers.google.com and log in. Once we're there, we need to create a new project. Below you can see the example project, Auth Test. And now we'll go through setting up the consent screen. So once you go create a new project, you're going to get taken over to the OAuth consent screen. On this consent screen, it's where you go and put things like your privacy policy, a link to your the front of your application or your website, and also what permissions you are asking for from Google, so that people can make an informed decision as to whether they want to allow the federation with their Google account. Now, in this case, I'm going to create an external application, which is available to everybody. An internal one is only one available to users in your organization. Now, in this case, of course, because I'm using a Gmail account, it's not really an option. But if I was using one of my G Suite accounts, then we could limit the application. If you were building an application just for your users, then I'd recommend looking at using the internal user type and limiting access to just your domains. For this one, just going to use the name Auth Test on the right hand side, and I haven't actually given anything in the OAuth test, in the OAuth consent screen in terms of privacy policies and everything. I've just left them blank. Okay. Once we've completed creating our new application, we need to set up some credentials. So with our application selected, we go to the credentials on the left-hand side menu and go OAuth client ID as the credentials type. From there, we get to pick which application type we want. Do we want to use a web application, an Android application, a Chrome app, an iOS, TVs or other similar devices such as that, a desktop app, or a universal Windows platform? Now this is going to be an OAuth 2.0, so that it integrates with Cognito. And we're just going to use the web application in this example. Of course, you can have more than one of these so that you can manage your credentials for different types of environments. The OAuth client ID, we give it a name, so just leaving it as the default in this one, web client 1. And you'll notice down the bottom there, authorized JavaScript origins and authorized redirect URIs. Right now, when you're creating the credentials, you need to leave those blank. We'll fill those in a little bit later once we've created the authentication module inside of Amplify. So click create, and hopefully we should get some credentials like this. Now we need to know these items. So when you're doing this on your laptop in your development environment, I suggest keeping this screen open because you'll need them in the next step. All right, let's add the module to Amplify. So it's a very simple process of Amplify add auth and following the wizard through. So we just select a default configuration with social provider. We're going to use the username. I'm not going to want to change anything more. We let it pick the domains prefix. I'm not too worried about it for this example. Then we use that localhost :3000 as I was talking about before for our sign-in URI and our sign-out URI. Now, in a real-world example, you might want to actually have this go to the first user screen after sign-in and check that your user is authenticated and then present their dashboard or whatever it is that you've got in your application. The sign-out URI redirect, you might want to set that back to the sign-in page or maybe the home page of your organization, depending on your use case. Now, for the Google Web Client and the Google Web Client secret, these are the two items that we saw in the previous screen that provided from the OAuth setup credentials from Google. So copy and paste those as they were presented, and then we're ready to go. Now we need to do an Amplify push to build all those items at the back end. So this is where Amplify will go and send some CloudFormation up to AWS, build the Cognito user identity, and provide us with a backend so that we can integrate this into our application. Once that's completed, you should get something like the top here. That output is really important because we're going to use that to populate those two empty URIs that we did as part of our credential setup earlier. So we copy and paste this and put it into the URI for the authorized JavaScript origins, noting that it's really important to make sure the trailing slash is not included. In the authorized redirect URIs, we copy and paste this and we add in OAuth 2/IDP response, which means that once we've got our authentication from Google, we pass that information back to Cognito via this path. You'll also note that the URL is using Amazon Cognito, so this is not specifically part of your application front end. It's Cognito. You can, if you want to, set up custom domains as part of Cognito, but for today I'm not going to cover that. Alrighty, let's get into looking at writing our application. Okay, so this is half the code. I'll show you the second half of the code in a little bit. If you think about the default app.js that a React app sets up with Amplify, it's a pretty straightforward thing. We've got a few imports that we do, but we need to add a few more. So we need the auth and hub from Amplify, and we need the use state and use effect from React, because we need to be able to manipulate the state, or at least gather the state, and we need the auth component. It's very important for this piece, of course. And just the config that we pull in for every part of our Amplify application. So in this example, we're just going to create a new function called app, create some variables, user and set user, pull those in from the use state function or method, and then we're going to listen to an auth event and make some decisions based on what that event looks like. Is it a sign-in event? Is it a Cognito hosted UI event? A sign-out event? A sign-in failure event? Or a Cognito hosted UI failure? So depending on what's going on here, so if it's a get user, if it's a Cognito hosted UI event, then we're going to use the get user function, which we'll show in a little bit. And we're going to set those constants to some variables so that we can present them to you and show a really simple application working. And then right at the bottom, after the use effect, we've got a get user, which is going to go and pull the user data. All right, so let's take a look at the get user function. Pretty straightforward. We've got an auth object that's coming in, and we just want to get the current authenticated user, and then we populate the user data. If that fails, so i.e. there's no one signed in, all we're going to do is log something to the JavaScript console in your browser with not signed in. Pretty straightforward in this example. Then in our return section, where we do our visualization of what's going on, we're doing a really simple one that if we've got a user there, we're going to present the sign out button. And if we've got no user presented, then we're going to use we're going to present a federated sign in button, and call the auth.federated sign-in with the provider set to Google. Above that, and the presentation is going to also show us the user who is logged in and some of the information that's presented to us from Google. And then, of course, we just present that back to the Amplify runtime so that we run this app. Okay then, once we've done that code, let's run it on our local host and see what happens. Hopefully the first time we go there, we get something like this. You can see the URL in the URL bar, the user is set to none, and we've got a federated sign-in page, a sign-in button. From there, we click the federated sign-in button, and we're going to be presented with the Google sign-in. In this case, on this particular browser, I was signed in twice, so I've got two different accounts there to choose from. I can pick one of those, and hopefully I end up going back to my first page, and I get something like this. Here you can see that I've been logged in, and I've got some information that's being handed back to me by Cognito and Google, such as things like my email address, has the email been verified, my user ID, and things like that. From here, you'll be able to use some of this information to populate DynamoDB or call other items, get credentials for STS so that you can limit my access, for example, and that sort of thing. You can also see now that the button has changed to a sign out. Awesome. Great work. So the first time I did this, It took me about 2 hours, I guess, to get it all up and running. It was, I had made a bit of a mistake earlier on, and I didn't quite understand, and that's why I've kind of walked you through those components of the JavaScript authorized URIs. They are really, really important. So what's next? In the a couple of things that I found, I was also doing the Amplify Console, and I found that you had to set the variables. I couldn't find this in the documentation, so be careful. So those two variables, the client ID and the client secret, you need to populate those as environment variables in the console to do deployments. Further reading, you can find more information at the following two URLs from the Amplify docs. The first one is just on the authentication specifically itself, and the second one is on how to integrate it with the GraphQL API, for example. All right, let's do a quick run through of the Amplify console. So AWS console plus Amplify plus your Git, your favorite Git repo equals the Amplify console. Awesome. There is native integration with GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, and of course our favorite, Code Commit. The Amplify console lets you do full stack app deployments, so you can use Vue or React Native or any other framework that you've got or that's supported by Amplify. You can create static apps such as a simple blog that's just with something like Hugo, for example, or you can do a full progressive web application and deploy them from the Amplify console as well. Alrighty, so after you go through and integrate with your favorite GitHub repo, you get to go through these first steps. So you do a first successful build of your app. In this case, I created a simple one called console test. I added a custom domain, which I'll touch on in a second. Set up some versions of some branches and password protected one of my branches. There's also this really cool feature which I didn't get a chance to look at because I had made this repo public and it needs to be private, is the pull request previews, which gives you a preview of what your application looks on your branches, which I think is pretty neat. So in this example, I've got a domain that I use called Performance Magic. I created a subdomain called Console Test. I've set the master branch to be consoletest.performancemagic.com, and then the feature one branch to be feature1.console.test.performancemagic.com. So Amplify set up all the Route 53 configuration. It set up all of the certificates for me, all the front end, everything. All the integration was done. I didn't have to think about this at all. There is also a way to set up a automated URL creation when a new branch is seen, which I think is pretty awesome, so that you can have automated feature branches showing up so people could go and look at what's going on with your feature. Here you can see the branches being managed, the master branch there, and then there's a build currently going on for the Feature 01 branch, and password protection. So in the Feature 01 branch, I don't want to have everyone in the world seeing my feature or being crawled by Google, so I'm just going to set it restricted. Pretty straightforward. You change the access setting to restricted, put in a username and password, and you're done and dusted. I think that's a pretty cool feature because I always have product managers coming to me making sure that we don't have our UAT environments or other such things sitting out on the web. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.